The Airbus A320 shuddered, and then fell silent. Elizabeth McHugh gripped the armrests as the whine of the engines died into something worse than noise. 3,000 feet above the Bronx, the roar of twin turbines had become a whisper, then nothing at all. And in that terrible quiet, she understood what silence meant when you were supposed to be flying. Through her window, the city sprawled below, indifferent and vast, while around her, strangers began to realize that the laws of the sky had just been suspended. The flight attendants moved with urgent precision, their voices steady but their eyes revealing what words could not. And then, crackling through the intercom, came the captain's voice, calm as stone, "Brace for impact." Fred Beretta hunched forward in his seat, his forehead nearly touching his knees, and felt the booklet in his jacket pocket press against his ribs. That morning, in a hotel room in Manhattan, he had found it wedged deep in his briefcase, a prayer guide he hadn't looked at in years. Stuffed among spreadsheets and quarterly reports, he had almost thrown it away. Now, as the plane descended in eerie silence toward the frozen Hudson River, he pulled it out with trembling hands and whispered the words he had ignored for so long. Around him, passengers clasped hands with strangers, murmured the Lord's Prayer, made the sign of the cross. In row after row, people who had boarded as individuals became a congregation of the desperate, unified by one shared and terrible understanding. They were about to die. The flight attendants shouted instructions, heads down, feet flat, hands covering skulls, but beneath the commands ran a river of prayer. "Please, Jesus," someone whispered. "Not like this," another voice pleaded into the silence. Elizabeth McHugh closed her eyes and prayed with an intensity she had never known, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, formless plea for mercy. This was not the polite prayer of Sunday mornings or the rote grace before meals. This was the raw cry of a soul confronting the edge of existence. And in the cabin of U.S. Airways, Flight 1549, as the grey water of the Hudson rushed up to meet them, heaven was bombarded with the prayers of 150 terrified hearts. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. It had started as an ordinary Thursday. Flight 1549 lifted off from LaGuardia at 3:25 in the afternoon on January 15, 2009, bound for Charlotte, carrying people whose biggest concerns were connecting flights and dinner plans. Elizabeth McHugh, a 64-year-old grandmother from North Carolina, had settled into her aisle seat near the back, grateful for the routine journey home. Fred Beretta, a banker on business, had checked into his Manhattan hotel barely an hour before the flight, his mind already moving ahead to meetings and margins. In the cockpit, Captain Chesley, Sully Sullenberger, and First Officer Jeff Skiles prepared for what should have been a forgettable leg of a forgettable day. The plane was 10 years old, meticulously maintained, and the skies over New York were clear and cold. Sullenberger was the kind of pilot passengers never noticed. Competent.com, with 42 years of flying experience etched into muscle memory. Skiles, the first officer, brought his own depth of skill to the cockpit, and together they ran through the pre-flight checklist with the ease of men who had done this 1,000 times. The 150 passengers settled into their seats, some reading, some dozing, some staring out at the Manhattan skyline as it fell away beneath them. No one was thinking about miracles or disasters or the fragility of metal and air. They were thinking about home, about work, about the small ordinary concerns that fill the minutes before everything changes. The plane climbed steadily, reaching 2,900 feet, and for a moment, the world below looked beautiful and serene. At 3:27, 2 minutes after takeoff, the plane struck a flock of Canada geese. The collision was massive birds weighing 18 pounds each, sucked into both engines with catastrophic force, shredding turbines and filling the cockpit with the acrid smell of burning flesh. "Birds," Sullenberger shouted, and then both engines went silent. In the cabin, passengers heard a sound they would never forget, the sudden, unnatural quiet of a plane that had stopped being a plane and become a glider. Some thought a cargo door had blown open. Others thought they'd heard an explosion. No one yet understood that they were falling. The plane was 3 miles up, directly over the most densely populated city in America, and it had just lost all power. The silence was broken by the flight attendant's urgent commands and the rising murmur of fear. Some passengers gripped the seats in front of them, knuckles white. Others turned to the windows, watching the earth rise toward them with sickening speed. Fred Beretta sat in stunned shock, his mind struggling to process what his body already knew. This was it, the end. He thought of his family, of how much his death would hurt them, and the thought was more painful than fear. He thought of all the years he had spent accumulating wealth, chasing success, building security out of dollars and contracts and deals, and now, none of it mattered. He was a man in a falling plane, and money could not buy him one more second of life. The realization cut through him like ice water. He had spent his life building on sand. Then he remembered the booklet. He didn't know why he'd cleaned out his briefcase that morning, or why he'd paused when he found the old prayer guide, or why he'd slipped it into his jacket instead of the trash. Now, with shaking hands, he opened it and began to pray the chaplet of divine mercy. The words felt foreign on his tongue at first, awkward and unfamiliar, but, as the plane descended, something shifted inside him. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, he truly trusted, not in his own cleverness, not in the odds, not in some vague hope that everything would work out. He trusted God. The plane was going down at 120 miles per hour, and Fred Beretta felt, impossibly, at peace. He hunched over to brace for impact, praying to Hail Marys and an Our Father, and was halfway through a prayer to St. Michael when the plane hit the water. The impact was massive, a collision of metal and river that should have torn the aircraft apart. The Airbus slammed into the Hudson at precisely the angle needed to survive, too steep and it would have disintegrated, too shallow and it would have cartwheeled. Sullenberger, drawing on every hour of his 42 years of experience, had threaded an impossible needle. The plane skipped once, then settled onto the surface, bobbing like a child's toy in a bathtub. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then, water began pouring in through the ruptured rear of the fuselage, cold and shockingly fast, and the cabin erupted into controlled chaos. The flight attendants, shouting over the rising panic, directed passengers toward the emergency exits. Some climbed onto the wings. Others waded into the icy water, gasping as the cold struck them like a fist. Elizabeth McHugh, still in her seat, opened her eyes and realized she was alive. "Thank you, God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Around her, passengers were crying, praying, embracing strangers. The water was rising, but they were not sinking. The plane floated, crippled but intact, in the middle of the Hudson River. Through the windows, they could see the Manhattan skyline, impossibly close, and the first of the rescue boats already racing toward them. Within minutes, ferries and tugboats and Coast Guard vessels surrounded the plane, pulling passengers from the wings and the water. Hypothermia was setting in for many, and one woman had broken both legs, but incredibly, miraculously, no one had died. All 155 people aboard Flight 1549 were alive. Fred Beretta stood on the wing, shivering in the January cold, and felt tears streaming down his face. He had been given back his life not because he deserved it, not because he had earned it, but by grace, pure, unmerited, inexplicable grace. He looked at the booklet still clutched in his hand, now soaked and wrinkled, and understood that God had been preparing him for this moment. The morning cleaning of his briefcase, the discovery of the prayer guide, even the flight itself, all of it, had been leading to this. He had been allowed to face death so that he could learn, finally, what life was for. Not for accumulation or achievement or the building of earthly kingdoms, but for trust, for surrender, for the peace that comes when you place everything, even your last breath, into the hands of God. Captain Sullenberger was the last to leave the plane, walking the length of the cabin twice to ensure no one had been left behind. When he finally stepped onto the wing, rescue workers pulled him into a boat, and the crowd watching from the Manhattan shore erupted in cheers. Governor David Paterson would call it the miracle on the Hudson, and the name stuck because no other words sufficed. In the history of aviation, no commercial jet had ever successfully ditched on water without casualties. And yet here, In the freezing waters of the Hudson, with a city of millions watching, every single person had survived. The media would call Sullenberger a hero. And he was, but he was also a man who had simply done his job with extraordinary skill. The true story was bigger than any one person. It was a story of teamwork, of training, of luck and providence intertwined in the days that followed. Passengers gathered to tell their stories. They spoke of the silence, of the prayers, of the moment they realized they might not die after all. Some had been changed in ways they were still trying to understand. Fred Beretta returned to his banking career, but he was no longer the same man. He began attending Mass regularly, praying the rosary, living with a gratitude that colored every moment. "I still have my boarding pass," he would say, marveling at the numbers. Flight 1549, on January 15th, from Gate 15, with 155 passengers, departing at the 15th hour. 15, over and over, like a signature written in Providence. Elizabeth McHugh, too, was changed. She had looked death in the face and been spared, and the experience had given her a clarity about what mattered and what didn't. "I prayed and prayed and prayed," she told reporters. "I believed God would save us." The rescue itself had been its own kind of miracle. The ferry boats that arrived within minutes, the helicopter pilots who plucked passengers from the icy water, the first responders who moved with practiced urgency in a city that still carried the scars of September 11th. The sight of a plane in distress had triggered old fears, but this time the story ended differently. This time, everyone went home. The passengers were reunited with their families. The crew was lauded for their professionalism, and Sullenberger found himself thrust into a spotlight he never sought. He deflected the praise, insisting that he had simply drawn on years of training, that any competent pilot would have done the same. But those who had been on the plane knew differently. They had felt the terror, the silence, the impossible odds, and they had seen grace. In the weeks and months that followed, some passengers struggled with post-traumatic stress flashbacks, panic attacks, the sudden inability to board a plane without counting to 90 seconds, the moment when the birds had struck. Others found themselves unable to stop thinking about how close they had come to death, how thin the line between catastrophe and survival truly is. But many also spoke of a deeper change, a shift in perspective that was harder to name. They had been given a second chance, and they felt the weight of it. Fred Beretta would later reflect that the crash had taught him what true peace was: not the absence of crisis, but the presence of trust in the midst of it. "Under the most precarious situation I could ever imagine," he said, "God taught me what true peace is all about, that it's found in accepting God's will." The miracle on the Hudson became a symbol, a story the nation needed in the middle of economic collapse and mounting despair. It was proof that sometimes, against all odds, things work out. That skill and providence can align. That heroes still walk among us, and that grace still breaks through. But for those who were on the plane, the story was more personal and more profound. They had prayed in the silence, surrendered in the face of death, and been delivered. Not because they were special or deserving, but because on that cold January day, mercy had names: Sullenberger and Doyle and Denton Welsh, the ferry captains and the Coast Guard, the tugboat operators and the helicopter pilots, and behind all of them, the passengers believed, was a hand that steadies planes and calms waters and hears the prayers of the desperate. Years later, survivors would gather for reunions, drawn together by the bond of shared trauma and shared deliverance. They would embrace and weep and laugh, marveling that they were still here, still breathing. "We are joined forever," Sullenberger told them, because of January 15th. And they were, not just by the accident, but by the grace that had carried them through it, by the prayers that had filled the cabin, by the silence that had taught them what mattered, by the cold water of the Hudson that had received them without taking their lives. They had been to the edge and brought back, and the experience had marked them indelibly. Some spoke of it as a second birth, a moment when everything that came before was divided from everything that came after. Elizabeth McHugh would tell her grandchildren about the day she almost died, about how she had prayed with every fiber of her being and been answered. Fred Beretta would keep his boarding pass framed on his desk. a daily reminder of the day God gave him back his life. And across the country, people who had never been on Flight 1549 would hear the story and feel their own faith stirred. Because the miracle on the Hudson was not just about one plane or one pilot or one impossible landing. It was about the mystery of grace, the power of prayer, and the truth that sometimes, just sometimes, we are saved, not by our own strength or cleverness or worthiness, but by something larger than ourselves, something we can barely name. On January 15, 2009, 155 people learned that lesson in the most visceral way possible. They learned it in the silence of failing engines, in the desperate whisper of prayer, in the shocking cold of the Hudson River, and in the impossible joy of survival. They learned that miracles still happen. And they learned it together. This account is drawn from extensive reporting by major news outlets, including the New York Times, BBC News, CNN, and Time magazine, which documented the January 15, 2009, emergency landing of U.S. Airways Flight 1549. On the Hudson River, the personal faith experiences of passengers Fred Beretta and Elizabeth McHugh were recorded in interviews with the Divine Mercy magazine and the New York Times respectively. Captain Sullenberger's account of the event appears in his memoir Highest Duty and in numerous interviews, including with Katie Couric on 60 Minutes. The incident, universally known as the Miracle on the Hudson, stands as one of the most successful emergency water landings in aviation history, a testament to skill, teamwork, and for many who lived it, the power of faith and prayer in humanity's darkest moments.